All right, well, it's 12 o'clock. So just to be mindful of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know we'll probably have quite a few people joining yet, but I would like to just introduce myself. My name is Trisha Wagner, and I am the a grant writer and program development coordinator for ECIA. And I was able to set up this training through a grant that we received from the USDA. And I will go ahead, I'll introduce our presenters here in a minute, but just a quick housekeeping item. We're going to ask you to please save your questions for the end. We're going to go through the 3 presentations, and then after the presenters are done speaking, we'll go ahead and have questions and open discussion. So welcome. Patrick Callahan is here in the office with me. Jill Connors and David Heiar are online via Zoom. Patrick served as a city manager for Maquoketa, Iowa from 1978 to 93, and as a city administrator for Anamosa from 2006 to 2010. He also served as a consultant to cities for the Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Iowa from 93 to 2005. He worked as a municipal consultant for Snyder Associates from 2010 to 2013. He established Callahan Municipal Consultants, LLC in 2013 and provides numerous consulting services to cities. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from Loras College and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Iowa. Jill Connors has been with the City of Dubuque's Economic Development Department since 2014 and director since 2019. In her role, she coordinates with multiple departments and private sector partners to facilitate local multi-million-dollar business expansion, building redevelopment, and housing creation projects. Much of this work utilizes tax increment financing as a funding source. Jill is knowledgeable in the areas of urban renewal district creation and management, as well as compliance requirements and drafting development agreements when using the tool. David Heiar has over 35 years of experience in city government in 3 eastern Iowa cities, which includes Bellevue, Manchester, and Dubuque. He joined the Alliance in July of 2013. His background includes downtown redevelopment, community development, rural and urban economic development, including workforce development, existing industry services, business attraction, and new business development. David Heiar is a Jackson County native. So welcome, and I will go ahead and let Pat get started.
Okay, well, thank you, Tricia. This is kind of TIF 101 for some folks. So there's quite a number of you, though, that know a lot about TIF. And as I looked through the list of people, I saw Tim Vick out there and Beth Bonds, and I'm thinking they know more about TIF than me, so they could do this workshop. So Tim and Beth, if I start losing my voice, I'm going to turn it over to you folks, okay? But my experience in TIF goes back a long ways. And as you saw, I started in city government in 1974. Let me move the slide here. There we go. I started in 1974 and long time ago, okay? Some of you probably weren't even born then, I don't know. So, but I've seen TIF from a lot of different perspectives, from working with the city of Anamosa and Maquoketa, but I also, as Tricia said, worked at the Institute of Public Affairs, where I wrote some papers on it. And then with Renewal Securities, also helped city do bond issues when they were using TIF money to pay the money back, and then saw it from the perspective of the engineering firm with Snyder Associates. So I've kind of seen TIF from a lot of different directions over the years. And I always tell people, I am not an attorney. So everything you hear today, you need to run by your attorney if you have any questions, because the first thing I need to tell you about TIF, you can't do this by yourself. You need a bonding attorney, because if you don't have a bonding attorney, you run the risk of making some serious mistakes. Now, what I will tell you is that you might think, well, we can just use the local city attorney because they do all of our work. And you might have your council members say that, but use this analogy, okay? And I always like to use this medical analogy. If you need open heart surgery, are you going to go to your general practitioner and have that general practitioner do the open heart surgery? No, you're not. You're going to find the best cardiologist you can find to do that. TIF is open heart surgery, folks. So you need to find a good bonding attorney. Most of those good bonding attorneys are with firms in Des Moines. I know most everything I know about TIF, I learned from a gentleman named Bob Jostin, and many of the handouts that you saw here today were things that he had done. And unfortunately, Bob passed away here not too long ago, and I had the opportunity to talk to him about a week before he passed. And believe it or not, we talked about TIF. And so I mentioned the handout that I use. I've also learned a lot about TIF from two other gentlemen, John Danos, and with his permission, I've used some of his handouts that you saw in that little packet. And then I also learned a lot from another gentleman named Mark Corey with another law firm in Dubuque. So bottom line is, when it comes to TIF, you got to do your research. And all the handouts that I've given you in this supplemental packet, some of those handouts, are older, but for the most part, they're right on target. But TIF is always changing, it seems like. So you need to be sure that you have a good bonding attorney. So what is TIF? Well, let's break it down. It's an acronym, of course. It stands for Tax Increment Financing. And by tax, we mean property taxes. By increment, we mean the increase in the value of property taxes because of something that was built or constructed. And lastly, the word financing. We're going to generate some money here, and we're going to use that money for economic development related activities. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, the basics of TIF, and that is, as I mentioned, we're talking about property tax money. And by the way, for those of you who know TIF, I readily admit that this is kind of a 101. So if you want to have lunch and come back at 12:40, you can do that, okay? But it's taking property tax money and reallocating it to a project that you're trying to do in your community. But the key thing is it's the result of increase in taxable value, not all the current tax money. You've got to have an increase plus the word increment in order for you to do a project or to pay for a project. So it's the increment, the increase in taxation that comes in as a result of the project that will now go into a city created TIF fund. And there are some cities that have more than one TIF account. So, but just a quick overview of TIF and how it started. Well, it goes back to about 1969. And in 1969, the Iowa legislature passed an urban renewal law. And it was also in the 1960s that cities were starting to talk about urban renewal. I remember as a young boy hearing about the Dubuque Urban Renewal Project, and they were doing some great things in downtown Dubuque. And there was other cities out there doing it as well. And they were then looking for money to kind of match some of these federal grants that were coming in for urban renewal. There's another piece of history that's kind of interesting that impacts TIF, and that is there was a member of the Iowa Supreme Court, Justice Dillon, and Justice Dillon basically wrote an opinion that said, hey, city government, unless the Code of Iowa lets you do it, unless the Code of Iowa authorizes it, you can't do it. Well, that then brought about what is called home rule in 1968. And basically why that was so important was that home rule said, well, if the Code of Iowa doesn't prohibit a city from doing it, hey, it's fair game, you can do it, with one exception, taxation. So that was kind of the impetus to get going and putting some tools into place that would be useful to cities in doing things like providing money for infrastructure, street, water, and sewer in your community, providing money for various improvement projects, and also to provide money for economic development projects. And there was another key piece of history that really had an impact on TIF and your ability to use TIF for economic development. And that's when the legislature, I think about 1995, basically said, economic development is a public purpose. Prior to that time, it was an economic development project. You might not be using any public money, any tax money at all for a project like that. But because that change in the law came, it allowed then for economic development to now be a public purpose in the state of Iowa, which then authorized grants to developers. Now, some of the common uses of TIF include basic infrastructure projects. one of the handouts that I gave you was a handout that I just downloaded recently from the Iowa League of Cities website. And it talks about some of the numbers related to TIF. And 54% of the cities in Iowa have used TIF for basic infrastructure projects. Other things they've used is development or redevelopment of areas in the community. And of course, we've all heard about the economic development projects that have taken place throughout the state, some of which have been kind of controversial, and some of which have been used by the folks in the legislature to say, we better put some controls on this TIF. It's getting a little bit out of hand. But nonetheless, there's been a lot of cities to make good use of it. And the other thing is that there's a few cities, not a lot, have used TIF for things like public buildings, fire stations, police stations, wastewater treatment plants. But the thing you got to remember, there are limitations on how you do that. And you got to prove there was no other option in order to fund that project. And you also have to say it's tied to economic development. So those are all things that TIF has been used for in the past. Now, a couple quick differences that I want to talk to you about very quickly, and then we're going back to TIF. And that is, there is things that we refer to TIF, and that's chapter 403 of the Code of Iowa. By the way, if you can't sleep at night, download chapter 403. I'll guarantee you it'll put you to sleep because it's really boring and it's really long. And we're going to break down 403 for you here later today. But there's another chapter called chapter 405 called tax abatement. Totally different subject, totally different approach, but both have been used for economic development and both have been used to increase housing in your community. One of the things I've given you in your packet is information about tax abatement, but we're not going to focus on that today. We're going to focus on TIF. And if you would like more information about the difference between the two, read my handouts or give me a call. Okay, the value of TIF. It is critical for the infrastructure for economic development projects. It can also be used to retain and create new jobs in the community as well. But the bottom line is we want TIF to increase property tax values, because if that doesn't happen, you're not going to get any TIF revenue, and you're not going to make any improvements in your community. So there's got to be an increase in property tax values. And as a side benefit, if you create a TIF district and you get some new commercial enterprises, you're going to increase the likelihood of increasing your sales tax revenue as well. So it's kind of a side benefit, but you won't do it on housing. So the basic steps of TIF. Now I have a handout in my supplemental handout from John Danos and from Bob Johnston, and I'm going to refer to that from time to time, but it has all these basic steps identified and what you need to do, because there are a lot of hoops you've got to jump through in order to implement a urban renewal plan, an urban renewal area, and a TIF district in your community. The first thing is you need to identify and plan the project, what it is we're hoping to do. And then you need to either update or adopt what is called an urban renewal plan. And once you've got that plan in place, then you can establish then an urban renewal area. So that's a very basic thing that you have to do before you collect one single dollar in TIF revenue. Now that urban renewal plan, you really need to read chapter 403, or at least have a bonding attorney kind of walk you through what's in 403, because you have to define the purpose of that plan. Why is it you're creating this urban renewal area? What are your objectives in doing it? So it has to be very clearly laid out what it is you're trying to accomplish by creating this urban renewal plan and now gaining access to tax increment financing money. Okay, once the area is established through this urban renewal plan, you start talking about what improvements you're going to make. Are you going to put in street? You're going to put in water and sewer? Is there going to be a new building that's going to be built? And with the change in law that happened a few years ago, you got to be very specific on what projects you're going to do now. You used to never have to do that. It was more of a generic plan, and we're going to make all kinds of great improvements, and it's going to be wonderful. Not so much anymore. You've got to be more specific on what those projects are going to be, and it's kind of nice to have cost estimates as well as you put together this particular plan. Now, the process that you have to follow is, first of all, you've got to go to your own planning and zoning commission. Which, by the way, you have to have a comprehensive plan in place first before you can have an urban renewal plan. Therefore, the purpose of going to the Planning and Zoning Commission is you say to your commission members, hey, folks, does this urban renewal plan fit in with the comprehensive plan? Are we doing anything that's contradictory to the comprehensive plan? The next big thing you need to do is your consultation visit with your county officials and your school officials. You have to set up a meeting in which you invite them in to hear more about this urban renewal plan and why you're doing it, how it could impact them. Now, they don't have veto power. They can't stop you from doing this, but you do have to listen to them. You do have to consult with them. And I think it's important that you reach out to your county and your school very early in this process. Tell them what the plan is, how it's going to impact the community, why it's a positive thing, why it's going to be good. Because there's too many cities that don't take this part seriously. And I can tell you, having been on a board of supervisors and having been to county meetings, there's a lot of county officials out there that do not like TIF. And they will use the opportunity to tell the legislature, we don't like TIF. And that is not a good thing for us, folks, because that results in more legislation reining in the ability to do TIF. So do reach out to those county and school officials. And of course, you have to have the standard public hearing, as you do on a lot of things. Okay, following through, then you need to designate the area. You need to define the boundaries of the TIF or the urban renewal area in your community. You then have to come up with some projects and improvements in this urban renewal area, and they got to be consistent with the plan that you have. Well, let's say you have the plan in place, it's been there for a couple of years, and suddenly someone says, you know, we should do this project as well. You need to look at that plan. And if that project and improvement is not identified in the plan, you need to do an amendment. Well, guess what, folks? When you do an amendment, you're starting all over again, okay? You're going back to square one as far as jumping through all those hoops again. So make sure when you do that initial urban renewal plan that you have as many items in there as far as what the improvements and projects are going to be, so you don't have to go back and amendment. But fully expect you will probably amend it someday. And when you do, be prepared to start the process all over again. And obviously you adopt it by resolution. So there's a lot of resolutions that you're going to pass throughout this whole process. Okay, just briefly, we're going to focus on housing today, and that's what Dave and Jill are going to talk about. But there's all kinds of different types of TIF. There's slum and blight removal. There's commercial and industrial TIF. There's low and moderate income housing TIF. The acronym LMI, if you've never heard that before, stands for low and moderate income housing. There's what is called non-LMI housing, which is housing that is going to be, sometimes upscale housing. And then sometimes there's mixed areas where you have a little bit of both. You have commercial and as well as housing. But if you want to know what type of TIF you're going to do, you need to go to chapter 403.2. And that talks about that slum and blight removal. And so there's some pretty stringent rules on some of the slum and blight removal. Okay, let's say you've got a housing project and you've got your urban renewal plan in place. It's already been approved. Okay, the next big step is to create a TIF district, and that is done by an ordinance. And that is an ordinance that most likely your bonding attorney is going to write for you. Do not attempt to write your own ordinance. Do not call the neighboring city next door and say, send me your ordinance. I'm just going to take out their name and put my name of my city in there. Do not do that. Reach out to a bonding attorney, because your TIF district and your urban renewal area might be different than the one that you're now going to be creating. So you need to describe the territory in great detail in this ordinance. And then once the ordinance has been approved and adopted by the council, it needs to be filed with the county. Now, a couple of interesting things is that there can be more than one TIF district inside an urban renewal area. And so there could be multiple TIF districts in one urban renewal area. And the actual TIF district could be smaller within the urban renewal area. And the reason you would do that is because of when you start bringing in TIF money, or with what we call the sunset provision. And so you might have one TIF district that starts bringing in money very early in the process. But because development takes place over an extended period of time, you may have another TIF district that is created maybe 3, 4, 5 years from now. So bottom line is the TIF districts all have to be contained within the urban renewal area. And there's a few situations out there where the TIF district is identical to the urban renewal area. So if you hear of a city that has one that's identical, that doesn't mean you have to do it that way. But the entire TIF district does have to be entirely within the urban renewal area. The best way to look at this is to say the urban renewal area is the umbrella that oversees the entire area that you're trying to improve upon and develop. Like I said, it could be the same, but you do have to have the urban renewal area match up with your urban renewal plan. But bottom line is TIF district has to be entirely located in the urban renewal area at all times. Okay, you've done all the right things now. You got an urban renewal plan, an urban renewal area. You've got TIF districts located in the urban renewal area. Now, how do you get your hands on some of that TIF money? Well, there's more hoops you got to jump through, okay? You have to incur some kind of a debt in order to get TIF money. You can't do all these things and then just send a quick email to the county auditor and say, hey, start sending me over that TIF money that I'm supposed to get. No, no, no. You have to incur some kind of debt, and you have to certify that debt to the county. Then you can start claiming some of that TIF money. And so once you get that TIF money, you will now use that TIF money to pay debt or pay off an obligation. By the way, John Danos gave me this, I identified it as handout B, TIF handout B, and John Danos really talks in that particular handout about this particular subject in more detail. Okay, what kind of debt are we talking about? Well, we all know what general obligation loans are. And by the way, I'm going to talk about general obligation bonds, general obligation loans, general obligation notes, all the same thing, one and the same. You got to jump through all the same hoops that you jump through when you do a project that is not paid with TIF. So keep in mind, simply because you have TIF does not exempt you from following all the same rules of issuing a GO loan, which then can be paid back with TIF money, or you might get a traditional bank loan as well. The other thing that some cities have done where they say, you know, I don't really need to borrow money from the outside, but I sure want to pay this. I sure want to pay for this project with TIF money. That's when you might do an internal loan, an internal debt within the city, where you borrow maybe from your sales tax fund, or you borrow from your general fund, and then you transfer that money to the TIF fund, and then use that money, or construction fund, and then you use that money to pay for the project. And then as you bring the TIF money in, you repay that internal debt. And so if you do that, there's still more hoops to jump through. And if you do that sort of option, make sure that you advise your bonding attorney on what you're doing. And then there's developers agreements. One of the TIFs that I did in Anamosa was we let the developer put in the infrastructure, and we basically provided him with a grant to do that, to pay for that infrastructure. So we had a developer's agreement, and that basically was a debt. We incurred an obligation now to pay that developer. And the way, of course, we came up with the money is we issued a general obligation loan or bond, and then provided that grant to the developer. And then we had to pay back the GO loan. And the way we paid it back was with TIF money that came in from the projects that the developer did. Now, there's one other thing called a pure TIF revenue loan. I and most people out there don't recommend you use a pure TIF revenue loan. And Bob Johnston talks about it in that handout that I gave you, his questions and answers on TIF, but it is also another option that you can pursue, but one that isn't always highly recommended. Okay. How much TIF money do you get, and how is it calculated? Well, the way TIF works is that the money that would have gone to the city's general fund and to the county's general fund and to the school's general fund and the community college general fund. That money all gets captured and is given to the cities for the TIF money, with some exceptions. Any debt service levy, I don't care who does it, city, county, school, if they have a debt service levy and there's new construction that's taking place, they get 100% of that new property tax money. You can't touch that. Also, the schools have two different levies that they have that obviously schools that we don't, and that is what's called a physical plant and equipment levy, or PEPL is the acronym. There's another one called the School Instructional Support Levy, which was added a few years ago. You got to subtract that from the levy. And so you start out with the full consolidated levy, the levies of all the entities, and then you start subtracting. And you start subtracting the debt service, the PEPL levy, and the School Instructional Support Levy. And the balance is what the TIF levy is going to be. That will determine how much money comes to the city's TIF fund. I have an example. The very last page of that handout I gave you shows you the things that get deducted from the general levy, and the balance then is your TIF levy. Now, prior to 1995, these TIF districts could run on a long time. There's some out there that have been there for years and years. And the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, said, wait a minute, we gotta cut this off. So they put in what is called the sunset provisions, meaning TIF districts are going to expire eventually. So commercial and industrial TIFs will expire after 20 years. So if you have a debt or an obligation, you got to make sure it gets paid for within 20 years. If you do a housing TIF, you will get a 10-year window of opportunity to work with. And if you don't get that debt paid off in 10 years, then the obligation will fall back on the taxpayer if you issue a general obligation bond. So be very careful with residential TIFs that you make sure you talk to your bonding attorney and your financial advisor so that you understand this is the window of opportunity to bring in this TIF money. And this is the only time we're going to have, with a couple exceptions I'm going to talk about. Okay, as I mentioned, housing TIFs are limited to 10 years. However, if you're a city of under 15,000 population, that's the key, under 15,000, you can go to your county board of supervisors and your school board and say, folks, we've got a great project going on here, but we're going to need another 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years to really accomplish what we want. If you convince both of those two boards, supervisors and school board, you can have another 5 years. Most cities don't even try and do it because they expect that they're going to run up against a brick wall on some of these folks. And so you would be wise to conclude that we only got 10 years to work with. And when it comes to looking at the time frame, you need to read section 403.22 of the code, because I've talked to a few bonding attorneys that said, depending on the timing of your TIF, sometimes you can squeeze out maybe that 11th year. Now, not all bonding attorneys agree with that, but you need to ask your bonding attorney, does 403.22 give me a little flexibility in case I would need that 11th year? You need to go into it assuming, though, that you've only got 10 years to work with. And if you're a city over 15,000, that is it. You only have 10 years. Okay, this is a very key part of this. And if you remember nothing else of this presentation, mark this one. That TIF has a sunset clock, and you determine when the clock starts running. And you don't want to start that clock running any sooner than you absolutely have to, because it will impact the total amount of TIF money that you will collect over that TIF time period. For example, if you TIF a residential area, and let's say there aren't very many houses that get built in the first 2, 3, or 4 years. You know, you got 1 or 2 houses in this 50-lot subdivision, and you start the TIF district and you start the clock running in year 1, you're going to have only a minimal amount of money coming in that first year. And you're better off to kind of sit back and watch the growth take place. And then at the most ideal time, start the clock running. And because then you've got the 10 years to work with, and you've got some really good value being built up in this new residential area. So, but you need to check and verify when that, if you've already got a residential TIF district, you need to check and verify when did the clock start running on this. Now let's come back to the types of obligation or debts that you can have to qualify for TIF money. As I mentioned, this TIF revenue loan option, one that I would not necessarily recommend, but if you have a financial advisor that's pushing you to look at that, it's rarely used. I did a white paper or discussion on the pros and cons of a TIF revenue bond versus a general obligation bond. And just send me an email. I'll be glad to send you that white paper I did a number of years ago. If you're going to go down that road, I would urge you to read that first. There isn't much advantage to a TIF revenue loan because there was an Iowa Supreme Court ruling years ago that said, I don't care if it is a revenue loan, it's still going to count against the city's debt limit or city's debt capacity. Even though the code would lead you to believe otherwise, there is a Supreme Court ruling that most bonding attorneys will adhere to, and they will not give you the permission to use that revenue and have it exempt from the geo debt limitations. There's the internal loans that I talked about. There's another thing called TIF rebate agreements. That is an obligation that you've now taken on, and that will qualify for TIF money, and you will then collect the TIF money and then rebate back to a developer some of that TIF money. And once again, they will pay their full tax bill, and you'll get a portion back. You'll get about 80% after all those other levies are deducted. You then rebate that money back to the developer that put in your residential subdivision. Things to consider. Here's another key point. Once again, if you take down nothing else from this presentation, this is important. If you do TIF, you can do what is called an annual appropriation clause. And the reason that is so important is that it allows you then to only count the annual payment against the city's general obligation limit, which of course we all know is 5% of the 100% assessed value of all the property in your community. And I tell people that geo debt capacity is a precious commodity that you don't use without giving it a lot of thought. If you have an annual appropriation clause in your development agreements, like your TIF rebate agreements, if you have an annual appropriation clause in there, only the annual amount counts. But if you don't have this clause, then the full value of the entire value of that development agreement that you have, or that bond issue that you have, counts against the debt limit. Now, there is a downside. If you have a GO bond and you have this annual appropriation clause, it may not qualify for tax exempt financing. So once again, all the more reason to talk to your bonding attorney and ask them, should we have an annual appropriation clause? Basically, you have a contractual obligation that you've now made that now qualifies your city to get this TIF money as new values start increasing. And if you are doing a project, one of the other things I urge you to do is, if you maybe are doing an internal loan, or maybe you haven't borrowed the money yet, you need to do a reimbursement resolution so you maintain the eligibility of your city to do tax exempt financing if that's the route you decide to go. So even though you may think you're going to do a GO bond down the road, and maybe you've already started working on it, ask your bonding attorney, do I need to do a reimbursement resolution that maintains my ability to do tax exempt financing? Now, there is a dark side to TIF, and you need to think about it before you use it. First and foremost, it will impact your general fund down the road. Not immediately, but as this new development takes place and this new revenue comes in, you're not going to get new revenue into your general fund. That's why I tell cities, boy, be very hesitant about TIFing the entire community. And there's cities out there that have done it. They have actually TIFed the entire community. So be careful about that one. And also be careful about the impact on your constitutional debt limit. And the other thing to keep in mind is no construction takes place, no TIF money. Okay, so keep that in mind. And also these minimum assessment agreements can have an impact on your financing. There are some limitations on housing. You have to have some LMI housing money set aside as part of your TIF program when you use TIF. And I think Dave and Jill might even talk a little bit about that, but I will talk a little bit more about it here. The other thing is annual reports. A lot of hoops you got to jump through on annual reports. And first and foremost, all of your projects have to be within the urban renewal area with one exception. If you're setting up an LMI project, that does not necessarily have to be in the urban renewal area. An LMI project can be outside the urban renewal area. Dave and Jill, I'm going to do one or two more slides, and I'm going to break from my presentation. I'm going to turn it over to you. So I just want to give you a little heads up here. Okay. What can you expect in the way of opposition? There are some county folks out there that do not like TIF. So you need to reach out to them early and often and let them know why TIF is a good thing for the community. Also, the public perception sometimes is not that great. You need to educate the public on what you're doing. And be very careful about carrying a huge surplus into your TIF fund, because you're supposed to spend that TIF money as it comes in. Every once in a while, I run across a city that has a huge amount of money just sitting in their TIF fund. That is not a good thing, folks. Don't do that. You should be asking for only the TIF money you need to pay a debt or an obligation, and also be very mindful of those sunset provisions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to who we got going first, Dave? Or?
Do you want to go to the next slide?
Okay.
I think it probably.
Okay. I'll come back to my slides. Okay. Let's see. There we go.
So it looks like we have Dave first.
I think we're going to go with Dave first.
Yep, Dave's going to be first.
So Dave, we're going to turn it over to you.
And just let us know if you want to share.
Okay.
So I just want to share a few things, and as Pat said, I'm going to focus on housing, how TIF can be used for housing projects, because I know that was a question that had been raised initially or early, and that's part of the purpose of this whole training. So a few different experiences, and of course mine are going to be from a rural perspective. When Jill talks, she'll be talking about a more urban center like Dubuque. Not that there's a whole lot of difference, but I just want everyone to understand that it can be used in rural communities and in large communities. So as Pat had pointed out earlier, when we look at housing, we need to establish whether it's an LMI, low and moderate income housing project, or a non-LMI project, because that will make a difference in how some of the funding is allocated. So the first project I want to share with you is what's called the Maquoketa Pocket Park Neighborhood Project, which is a pilot program. And this is an LMI housing project. So the 10 homes that were part of this program are all being sold, or have all been sold, to persons who qualify at 80% or less of the area median income. And let me share with you that this project took many partners, including the county, because the land that this is sitting on was basically donated by Jackson County. The city paid for the infrastructure, the streets and utilities, using tax increment, and we'll talk more about that. But the Iowa Finance Authority, the developer actually in this pilot program was ECIA, or their housing group, that really took the lead on the development of this project. So as you can see on the slide, the city used tax increment to pay for the infrastructure, water, sewer, and streets. And as this TIF revenue comes back in, it'll be used to repay a portion of the bonds that were sold to finance that infrastructure. Now, there is no set aside in this particular project because it already benefits LMI persons. So that's a little unique in this type of project, but Normally, there would be a portion of the TIF that has to be set aside for LMI. And as I said, already benefits LMI. So 100% of the TIF revenue, and again, not all property tax dollars, but the TIF dollars can be used to pay off that debt. Next slide, please.
There we go.
Touchy.
Thanks, Tricia. This is also a Maquoketa project, and this is a non-LMI housing. So it's a market rate housing project. Now, I should also tell you that this development is the first new subdivision in Maquoketa in over 9 years. And this Meadow Park, it has 28 residential lots. They're working right now on it was just approved, the subdivision was just approved, and the development agreement was just approved in December. So starting this spring, and I know they're out there now getting some of the site ready, but they'll start putting in the water, sewer, and streets. As Pat mentioned, it is important to get a bond counsel involved when you have a development agreement to make sure that you're complying with all the various aspects of the TIF regulations. The basic part of this particular agreement is that it is a 15-year TIF rebate for the cost of the infrastructure not to exceed $1.2 million or the actual infrastructure costs. So we have an estimate saying the infrastructure will cost $1.2 million. We didn't have bids. So once they actually have actual expenditures, whatever that amount is what they could receive as a rebate not to exceed 1.2 million over 15 years. As Pat also pointed out, because normally the city would have 10 years to provide this TIF rebate, but we knew that due to the cost of this infrastructure and to make it palatable to the developer, we were going to have to look at a 15-year payback. And so we reached out to the supervisors, we reached out to the school district, and we also reached out to the community college. Again, depending upon which bond counsel you're using, they may require that you get the community college to buy in or agree to this in addition to the county and the local school district. So in Jackson County, the set aside here for this project is about 40% that needs to be set aside for LMI. And that's really going to be based on the county's income limits. And again, this varies from year to year and from county to county. So you just need to always be looking at what the most specific numbers are as you put your development agreement together. And this one really is 60 point something that, it's just under 60% that will be rebated and just over 40% that will be set aside for LMI projects. But I'm just rounding out the numbers here to kind of make it simple, but just keep in mind that there has to be a set aside. Now, the nice thing about the set aside is that this is money that can be used for LMI housing anywhere in the community. So it could be used to assist with low-income senior housing. It can also be used as local match money for other projects, other grant funding that you might be working on for low-income housing projects. So there are lots of different ways the city can use that money. I know some communities have also used it to rehab lower income homes throughout their community. Next slide. So Preston, and you can see this new subdivision that was just completed last fall. The ribbon cutting was actually in December. This one's somewhat unique, I think, not typical, but again, a smaller community, and you sometimes have to do things that are necessary for development in your community. But again, this is going to be a market rate project. So there will be a set aside, and you can see at the bottom, a 40% of the TIF revenue from this project will have to be set aside for LMI projects. In this particular case, the city is actually the developer. They acquired the land. They put the infrastructure and the utilities in this subdivision. And again, they did reach out to the other taxing bodies to get their approval to be able to do a 15-year TIF rebate. The rebate will be going to the city to pay off a portion of their infrastructure bonds. The challenge with the city owning the subdivision is that every time they sell a lot, they have to have a public hearing. Even though there's an established price for these lots, there has to be a public hearing before the sale of lots. So the first public hearing on the first sale is next Monday night. So they have their first buyer in hand. Next slide, please. And so the last housing example I want to use is the city of Bellevue. Again, a more rural community. Bellevue too has some, well, in their case, they are really landlocked due to the river, the bluffs and floodplains. So, and finding land that's even for sale is a real challenge. So what you're seeing here is a 53-acre site that the city acquired, a piece of farm ground that's about a mile outside of the current city limits. It's really separated by Bellevue State Park from the current city limits. So the intent is to annex this land. What you're seeing here is really a conceptual idea of how it could be laid out with senior housing and some smaller lots, some larger lots, some lots for potential commercial up along the highway or apartment complexes. And this was put together by a group of University of Iowa students as one of their projects. So again, this is not a final plan, but more of a conceptual plan. The city did use tax increment to acquire this land, and we are now looking with their financial consultant, as Pat suggested you may want to also involve, but looking at with their financial consultant about how we might use tax increment or other means to fund the infrastructure costs to extend to this site, because it's going to take just over $2 million based on the estimate to extend utilities to this site. And that's a challenge for a small community, because that doesn't even take the utilities through the site. So we're still working through that, but looking at the possibility of using tax increment for that too. So with that, I will turn it over to Jill, and she can share some Dubuque examples.
Dave.
Thanks. All right. The first one that we have is North Cascade Road, and I'm going to pick up where Dave left off, talking about how to get infrastructure to the area. What you can see here is the big yellow portion is where the subdivision is going, but you'll see how it kind of snakes over along the roadway on the left-hand side of the visual. There were some road improvements that needed to happen there. And so we included that in the TIF district. That's how we were able to use TIF funding from the area in order to support the project. So we can use TIF to pay for some of the road improvements and utility installation. Something that happened here, this is for the Timberhurst Estates subdivision. We, so like I mentioned, you want to include all of the areas where you think you're going to need to spend TIF dollars for your public improvements. In this instance, we're using it for grading and roadway reconstruction, for traffic and safety related improvements, for storm sewer and drainage improvements, for water main extension, for lighting and fiber, and for a public park. One thing that I would mention here is that we held a public meeting, and I think that's a real good idea. Pat mentioned earlier meeting early and often with your county supervisors and with the school board. That's very important because you want them on board with what you're doing here. But you also want, if this is a newer tool that you're using in your community, it's a good idea to have a public meeting and invite people in and show them, put together some slides with some visuals so they can start to see what your vision is and help them understand that this does not increase their property taxes. That's probably the biggest concern that people have. So I think having a public meeting is probably a good idea. Do you want to go to the next slide, please?
Sorry.
Thank you. All right. So here again, a few different details about this one, which may not always be true, but if some of you are from smaller communities, it's very likely that you might be outside of the city limits. And Dave just mentioned that with his Bellevue example, that it's outside of the city limits. You have another hoop that you have to jump through. If you're going to be outside city limits, you can exercise your urban renewal authority within 2 miles of city limits, but you have to have a joint agreement with the county in order to do that. If your county's on board with your vision, with TIF in general, there probably is not going to be a problem. But we've gone to the county before for a joint agreement and had some questions and tabled the measure, and we had to come back again with some additional information just to help them understand what we were trying to accomplish. So that's an additional step you'll have to take. Also, and this happens more often if you're extending out into the county, the area may include what's called agricultural land. And that has nothing to do with land, with the zoning of the land. It's a very specific definition in Iowa code, which is agricultural land is more than 10 acres that have been used 3 out of the last 5 years for, crops. Or so it's very specific. Again, this is one of those instances. Go back to your bond attorney and make sure you understand whether or not you need to get consent from the property owners. So for instance, if you look at this North Cascade Road housing urban renewal area, as we travel along the road, county residents own to the center line. And so if we're including that roadway, we need every property owner along there to agree that yes, we can TIF part of their property. So that can get a little complicated, but it's certainly doable. Similar to what Dave mentioned, there's a set aside on this one. 38.1% is the amount of low income individuals in Dubuque County. That's where we get that 38.1% set aside number from. You can set aside more than that, but that's the bottom threshold, is the percentage of folks that are low income in your county. And again, which was mentioned before, that's going to change from year to year. So you have to stay on top of what that number is so you don't dip below it. Something that we use, so then the balance of that, the remaining increment is what we can use then for public improvements inside of the TIF district. So again, that set aside can be used anywhere in the community for to benefit low to moderate income households. That doesn't have to be infrastructure. So it doesn't have to be building houses for LMI individuals. It can be programming. So for instance, the city of Dubuque has a program which provides some down payment assistance for LMI residents. It can be used to support that type of programming. Next slide, please. Another example is Sky Blue Estates. This area is not far from Eagle Point Park. Maybe that gives you a reference. It was used for 2 subdivisions, and we knew that we needed a new water tower up on top of that hill. Well, one way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone was to make sure that we drew the perimeter around the area that included the subdivision and where the water tower was going to be constructed. That way we could use TIF funds as part of that balance. We didn't have to use, it's not part of the set aside, it's part of the balance we can use inside of that TIF district in order to provide infrastructure that benefits that subdivision and truly everything downhill from there. One additional step that we have, Pat had mentioned going to your planning and zoning commission in order to get approval for an urban renewal area. We did find out a couple of years ago, we had been taking even amendments to our long-range planning commission. And we found out that the state of Iowa only requires you to do that if it's a brand new area. And so now that when you create a new urban renewal area, we do take that to planning and zoning with their long-range planning commission. When we simply are amending a plan to add new projects, we no longer have to do that. We changed our city ordinance to match the state code on that one. Thank you. I think that's all I have. You can hit one more slide, but I think that was it for me. Yep.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Jill. All right, so I think what we're gonna do, Pat would like to see if anyone has any questions specifically for Jill or Dave at this point. And then when we're done with that portion, he's gonna go and just complete his slides and his presentation for those of you who want to see the remainder of the 101 presentation. So we'll go ahead, if anybody has, go ahead and unmute yourselves and let Dave and Jill know if you have any questions specific to their projects or the housing TIF.
One thing I had, Dave or Jill, that I think might be good for them to know is, where do they get that LMI number? Where does that number come from?
So my experience is that bond counsel has access to that. So when you're reaching out to your bond counsel to work through the project, they'll tell you, here's what your number is based on your county and what today's numbers are.
Any other questions for Dave or Jill? Okay.
Okay.
Oh, there's one in the chat. Oh, I have it. I keep reading. What does that say? Oh, good job, Beth and Jill. Thank you, Beth. Okay, so with that,
Okay.
thank you so much, Dave and Jill, for your presentations. Those were extremely helpful and informative, and we appreciate it. So you go ahead and
Okay.
you can
Well,
go back
for
to your-
those of you who have to, have another commitment, you've got my information, you've got my PowerPoint, you got the handouts. For those of you who are kind of new to TIF and you want to stick around a little longer, we'll go back and finish the slides. So let's see. Okay, picking up where I left off in terms of the reporting requirements. Obviously, you're going to have to file this TIF ordinance that creates your TIF districts. You're also going to have to do what is called a TIF indebtedness certification that gets filed with your county auditor. And then you're going to have to do an annual urban renewal report on the money that's collected and how it's used. So, and bear with me, there's a lot of things you got to do after this is all set up that someone needs to be you need to designate someone in the office as the TIF person who really knows the big picture and can get their arms around it. You also have to do your annual financial report, and there's some things in there with TIF you have to put down. You might even have to do a 1099 miscellaneous reporting on the money that you're sending in to a developer as part of your TIF rebate. So once again, talk to your bonding attorney and your financial advisor about that. Your outstanding debt report. All that information, of course, eventually many of it will end up with the Department of Management and all part of that system. So I would urge you to reach out to your county auditor early in this process and let them know what the plan is, what you're doing. They can help you many times with some of the reporting requirements. Also reach out to whoever does your annual audits. If you do annual audits, or maybe the firm or the state that recently did your annual audit. There's another person that is good to have on your side. His name is Ted Nielsen with the Iowa Department of Management. He's a great source of information, but bottom line, as you heard before, I keep coming back to that bonding attorney. Now, you may get a little pushback from the school district. Now, the good news is there that at least right now anyway, I don't think this has changed. There is some state backfill when you have a TIF district, the first $5.40 of assessed value or tax levy will be reimbursed to the schools, so they don't lose, the entire amount. And also remind them that the PEPL and instructional levy is totally outside of the TIF levy, and their debt service levy, that's all exempt too. So when you're talking to your school district, these are good talking points to have with those folks. Okay, there is a little known used out there where TIF money has been used to retire water and sewer revenue loans. I wasn't sure if it was legal. I was told by a bonding attorney, yes, it is legal, but you still follow all the same TIF rules. And but it might be of limited value because even though you're using TIF money to retire the debt, your utility rates still have to be high enough to pay the debt even without the TIF money. So limited value in my opinion, but it can be done. Okay, you decide you're going to do a TIF district. I think you need to identify who is on your TIF team so that you have all the right people sitting at the table and part of it and they know what you're doing. I think your county auditor, maybe even your county assessor needs to know. Obviously, your financial advisor and your bonding attorney. Reaching out to folks like Dave Heiar, your economic development director, and your staff. It's good to get those folks involved because they can be a tremendous help to you. You might even be your city engineer. And obviously, we're at ECIA here, so you need to reach out to your council of governments, no matter what district you're in. I know we got somebody in Jones County watching today, and they, of course, would reach out to EasyCog out of Cedar Rapids, but the folks at the COGS can be of great help. And if you need to have the city manager, city clerk, maybe even the city attorney involved and know, at least they all need to know what you're doing. And there's been some amendments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is when these reporting requirements got put into play. And then there's the penalty provisions were put in, and then the instructional support levy. But I'm going to spend a lot of time on these amendments. Another thing, if you ever want to use TIF for public buildings, you really got to justify it. You just can't say, hey, I'm going to use TIF to build a new city hall. Time out. No, you're not going to do that unless you jump through a lot of hoops. And then also, if you're looking at commercial TIF, you can't entice another business from another community to move to your community by dangling TIF out there for them. They have a term for that. They have called it anti-piracy laws. And so if you're working with a business or industry in another community and they want to move to your community and they're going to close down their plant or close down their business, you need to back down for a little bit and talk to your bonding attorney and make sure you do not violate this particular section of the law. And when you're considering a TIF project, and once again, we're going a little bit beyond residential, but I think it's good for you to have the big picture, and that is do you have a city policy when it comes to TIF? Because you might do one TIF district and have a developer involved. I will guarantee you that the next developer that comes along, they're going to want the exact same thing and more of what you give that first developer. So I think it's good to have a policy on how you're going to use TIF, policy on TIF rebates, and how this all fits into your long range goals for the city. And I think that's critical to do. As kind of a wrap up, I'm going to give you my suggestions on what I would do if I were, particularly if you're just starting from scratch here and you've never done a TIF district and you've never used TIF for residential development. Obviously, top of the list, bonding attorney. Also have a clear understanding of the project and clearly define why you want TIF, what it is you're going to use it for. You also need to, if you're working with a developer and working with anyone in this, you need some good questions. John Danos, in one of the supplemental handouts that he gave me, had a list of questions that I think are excellent. So go to John Danos's list of questions whenever you're working with a developer. And when you are working with a developer, do not commit real early in the process. Reserve judgment until you have reached out to your team to make sure you really understand what it is you now are committing the city to. So don't when that developer comes through the door, don't say, oh, you bet, we can do all that stuff. We want you here. We can't wait for you here. What do you need? Be very careful, reserve judgment. I think it's also good to conduct an overall analysis if you have TIF. I've done a couple of these for a couple of cities where we took a look at TIF. We looked at the past and how they used it. We look at the present. What do the numbers look like right now? And then we look to the future. How are we going to use TIF in the future? So if you're already into TIF, I think it doesn't hurt every once in a while to just to step back and look at the past, present, and future and what you want to do with TIF in your community. I think it's also critical that when you're looking at a TIF project, you do your own in-house analysis. What are the pros and cons of doing this particular TIF project? There may be some things that, you know, kind of are a negative involved. And so you need to make sure that you make it, that you have your council make a very informed and good decision so that you look at the pros and cons. And I think it's important to have a TIF calendar. Once you embark upon this, there are a lot of hoops you got to jump through, as you just heard. And some of these are very time sensitive, where you got to do certain things at certain times. I give you an example of a handout that I did in Anamosa that had all the steps listed and the time frame that we were looking at. And as I mentioned before, make sure you have that TIF team involved and that you keep them all informed of what you're doing. Just one word of caution on something other than residential, and that is competition, retail competition when you're doing commercial TIF. Because if you have, let's say you've got, no, let's use Cascade. They've got that Brothers grocery store there on the east side of Cascade. And man, they struggled for a while and they were so appreciative of getting that grocery store in town. And I think they might have used TIF involved to help do that. But what happens if another grocery store comes along? What if Hy-Vee says, hey, Cascade's a great place for us to locate? Now suddenly the light comes on. Can Cascade support 2 grocery stores? Maybe not. So be very careful with commercial TIF that you don't put somebody else out of business by the project that you just now promoted with TIF. And also look at the cash flow. When is that TIF money going to come in? And what is our obligations? When does that TIF money now have to get spent? Because the last thing you want to do is have a 10-year residential TIF and a 15-year GO bond issue, and the TIF money stops, and now you don't have the money to pay off the general obligation debt that you just incurred for that project. So do cash flow projections when you're doing a project like this very early on. And then compare the TIF revenue projections and predictions on how much money you're going to get, when you're going to get it, and then compare that to your debt payment schedules if you've incurred something like a general obligation loan. And Jill touched on this a little bit too. I think we really need to do a better job of keeping our county informed about what we're doing with TIF, because having been on that side of the table, I can tell you that, and maybe it's not the county supervisors in our area, but I can tell you in other parts of the state, there are supervisors out there that do not like TIF. And so we need to keep those people informed and look upon them as partners. And so I used to make it a point to, even when I was city administrator in Anamosa, I would go to the supervisors meetings every so often just to let them know what Anamosa was doing, just to keep them informed, and also keep your school district informed. And like I said before, I think before you get too involved in TIF, I think it's good to just step back and have a written policy about what you're going to use TIF for and what parameters you would like to use. I think it's also important to do regular reviews of what your TIF parameters are, what your policies are. And then another good thing is we all get new council members from time to time. And these new council members come on the scene and they know little or nothing about TIF. And so I think it's, for example, you could take my handouts here today, and when you get a new player, a new council member, or maybe a new city clerk or a new city manager, and say, we are using TIF and this is how we've been using it. And many times these folks will come in with little or no background on TIF. And TIF is a hard thing to put your arms around if you really have never been experienced with it or ever been exposed to it before. And I think it's also important to stay consistent with your policies and your procedures in terms of how you use TIF and the policies that you're going to adhere to throughout the process. And last but not least, keep learning about TIF. I learn something new all the time. For example, I did not know what Jill had just said about TIF in terms of the amendments and not necessarily have to going back to planning and zoning all the time with amendments. So once again, different bonding attorneys have different perspectives on TIF. And I've seen differences between one firm to the next. I've actually seen a difference of opinion between attorneys within the same firm. So that's why it's important for you to keep learning so that you know what questions to ask your bonding attorney, what questions to ask your financial advisor. And so I tell people, attend every workshop that you can on TIF if you're going to pursue it, because the League of Cities at their annual conference, it seems like every year there's some kind of workshop on TIF. And also when you do a good job on TIF, like Maquoketa and Preston and some of the folks, brag about those success stories so that the rest of us can reap the benefit of what you have done and maybe duplicate it or replicate it in our community. And lastly, do not abuse TIF. I've seen too many cities TIF the entire community. That's not what TIF was intended for. Okay, that analysis, like I said, past, current, and future, what the purposes are going to be, what the advantages are. I think it's good to step back every so often and look at that. I think with that, we have covered these slides. So I'm going to go right to the end. We're going to wrap it up and see if there's any last minute questions. I gave you what I call my supplemental handout. There's a lot of information in there on TIF, but do keep one thing in mind. TIF can change from time to time. So take anything that you see in these handouts, and verify it with your bonding attorney or your financial advisor. For example, there's one thing in Bob Johnston's handout that he did. It's called a Q&A on TIF. And that is after he wrote that, the instructional support levy for schools was added to the list of levies that can be subtracted. So, and there's more information on TIF in the policy leader handbook that the league puts out every year for new council members and city clerks. I think there's a section in your city clerk's manual on TIF that is good to read as well. So with that, we'll turn it back to.
Yeah, I see we have one chat. If
Okay.
anybody has questions, they can just unmute themselves or put it in the chat. That's fine too.
Yeah, and Trisha, that was from me. I'll just address it here verbally. Pat mentioned making sure that you meet with county and school board, and that your city council understands how the tool works. Every year during our economic development's budget presentation to city council, I include a visual. There's a nice triangular visual that shows how the tool works, helps city council understand that none of the taxing bodies are missing out on anything by using the tool. And so that's just something that might be nice to share as well with the county and the school board. So I'm happy to forward that to you, Trisha, and you can share it out to the participants today to help them see, here's what it looks like. Nobody's losing anything, and we all split a bigger slice of pie when it's all done.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that out. Any questions at all? Any questions for any of our presenters? Okay, well, if not, you do have their contact information and the PowerPoints and the handouts, and I will send out the recording of the presentation today to the people who were registered for this particular training, along with Jill's information that she's going to be sending to me. So I guess with that, I will thank everyone for joining. We certainly appreciate it. And thank you to our three presenters. Thank you, Pat and Jill and Dave. Very, very wonderful presentation today. Certainly appreciate it. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks.